Hey, your sound is messing up. You're coming in really distorted. Can you restart your Chrome browser and we'll restart this?
That
Hey,
hey, how's
okay,
that?
you're coming in great. Yeah, perfect.
Excellent, fantastic, no
All right.
worries.
This is the first installment of many that I want to do on this site, a Change My Mind series for, I know we've talked, but people that are watching now and are watching in the future. I love the competitive debating on Call Out. I think it absolutely has its place, but I would like to at least pioneer and start working on a kind of a change my mind style of debate and discussion where we're not just trying to win these debates, we're trying to convince and convey. So I'm gonna post topics. People are absolutely willing to change my mind. I'm absolutely open to my mind being changed. I hope you know that I'm coming into this incredibly open-minded, and willing to accept that I could be wrong at any time. That being said, I will of course defend the position, but I want to open it up with just saying I am pro-life. I do believe that life begins at conception. And I believe that since it is a human life, it is intrinsically valuable. Therefore, it is morally wrong to kill that life. Now, I want to leave more of the floor for you to convincing, and I'm just going to kind of ask questions and learn more about your view. So take it away.
Yeah, that all sounds really good. So yeah, let me just start off by commending you on starting this off. I think this is a really cool idea. And certainly if I come up with anything that I think might be interesting, I might look in putting up a similar thing in the future. So I guess we'll ask. This was kind of how I envisioned doing it. Is I have a particular stance which is pro-choice, and I have a couple of reasons for that. So I'll present that argument and try to defend that. I guess I'll just ask you a couple of questions regarding your opening statements to kind of set some groundwork.
Mhm.
You regarded, you said, firstly, life begins at conception, and then secondly, a human life is intrinsically valuable. The two questions I'd want to ask regarding that is that we know that, for example, it's not like life in the technical scientific sense, because things like the sperm cell, for example, prior to conception is also a living thing, like it is
Mhm.
alive.
Mhm.
So first question would be what is the distinction that you're making there? And then the second question would just be, well, I'll let you answer that one first and then we can talk about the
Okay,
other one.
so absolutely. So I want you. I don't want any misrepresenting going here. So I believe that it is a human life. So we are seeing the sperm meeting the egg, and once that zygote or embryo forms, it has its own intrinsic set of DNA. It is growing. The cells are multiplying on its own. It has DNA and traits and genes that are completely separate from that of the mother or the father. And while the embryo uses the mother as a station for growth, I don't believe that that takes away from its humanity in any way. Um, and so that's my view. I want to unpack that, but I really want to know what your view is first.
Yeah, that sounds good.
I, I
So that
just don't want to
would it be fair?
misrepresent you.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair.
Mhm.
Would it there be say fair to say that perhaps a better distinction would be, rather that life begins at conception, that the point at which that life becomes a human begins at conception?
Yes.
Is
Okay.
kind of the
Yes. So
yeah,
that
yeah,
that's
yeah.
that's the view that I'm operating under, is that it is a human life at conception.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. So it changes from something that is fundamentally not a human to something that is a human. Yep. Okay. Cool. That seems particularly reasonable. So my stance for being pro-choice rests, I think, on two main premises. The first has to do with a little more I guess less hardline approach about at what point something is gains personhood, and I think that happens at a state that is later than conception. And then the second point that I would identify is that when evaluating conflicting rights of something like a fetus or a zygote or an unborn child to the rights of a mother, that within a certain frame, I think that we are forced to consider that the rights of the mother trump the rights of a fetus or a developmental thing. What I think I'll take a fairly I think soft line on being pro-choice, insofar as that I would say that I would be okay with abortions for, like, if for any reason, voluntarily up to about a stage of 20 weeks, and then after 20 weeks would only be in circumstances where it is deemed that the mother's life is at risk. So I think that there are some legislations that push it, like, to 24 and 30 weeks. I think I'll take a sort of softer line stance to just say before 20 weeks.
Yeah.
Is what I'll support. So on the first part of argument around personhood, and I guess this is where I will throw you back the other question that I was going to ask you, which is that you say that human life is intrinsically valuable. Why do you believe that, for example, a human life is something that carries intrinsic value, whereas something that, but I'm making assumptions about here that you're perhaps not a vegetarian, where differentiate from, say, an animal life? Like what is the differential characteristic there that makes one thing inherently valuable and perhaps another life less so?
Okay, so yes, I don't want to take away from animals' value. Now, just a quick preface: I am a Christian, but I don't think that plays into my viewpoint on this. I think it influences it, but I don't think it's fair to bring that into the argument, because if you don't share that value, then it means nothing in the debate or the discussion. Now, from a purely like philosophical view, I believe that humans are intrinsically valued because we are conscious beings. We are creators. I think it's fair to say we are very different from animals in many respects, as far as like animals aren't creating civilizations and governments and technologies and things like that. I think that in that respect, humans are intrinsically valuable, and I think that's a fair thing, that I've seen very few people that don't think that humans are intrinsically valuable.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
That human life, like, because there are laws against murder and because there are like laws against taking lives, it's clear that governments in general are against the taking of lives in general. So I think that's a fair universal baseline of, we think that humans are valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the reason that I asked that question is because the way that I'm approaching this is I'm trying to find some sort of common ground that we can agree on, and then base moves on my arguments from there. So I think it's fair to say that, that, not to take away that, say, animals have no moral worth, but certainly I think we can agree that it's fair to say that animals have less moral worth than human. That given the choice between, a human needing to kill an animal to eat to live versus not doing that we would always be fine with the human being able to do that. The thing that you point to that I think is reasonable, and kind of what I have the basis of argument, is that the thing that makes us morally distinct from animals is our consciousness, right? Is our ability to exist at that sort of higher level. And that with that comes things like the fact that we are able to formulate systems of morals and act as moral agents who are capable of making those decisions, whereas animals are much more subject to those sort of things,
instinct and things like that.
Yeah, to instinct, and yeah, exactly. And that even that the extent to which we perhaps do place importance on animals about, why it would be wrong just to say kick a dog, even if you felt like it, is because, well, maybe animals still have like the experience of things like pain, right? So you could say that, for example, a human that is entitled to the full rights that we give full humans, noting that on stages of rights that we do restrict some rights for some children. For example, children aren't able to vote, right?
Yeah.
That's an example of a human. So a fully actualized human has all full rights, and then maybe sort of humans in development have like limited access of those rights, and then we would consider animals as having different kinds of rights that perhaps you should not. Even if we say it's okay to eat them, that you say you should not cause pain to an animal unless you are doing something useful with that, for example, right?
Yes.
So the argument that I'm then going to base, and the reason why I'm going to relate this to abortion, is because I think that your distinction about the point at which two cells become a human is something that starts conception. I think is perfectly reasonable. What I would identify as a counterclaim that I'm making is that the moment at which those two cells meet and conception actually starts, that because that there is nothing that is fundamentally scientifically changed at that moment, that there is not a significant moral difference between those two cells prior to conception to those two cells after conception. Now, once that development takes stage and grows into a fully developed human baby, then we can say that a significant change has happened to the point where now we would consider this a prototypical human, and we would start to unquestionably grant rights to it. In a similar sort of way that it's hard to pinpoint the exact point at which a child becomes a responsible enough adult to bestow upon them the right to vote, for example, and that happens at different stages of development for different people. But there are certain points at which we can point out and say, you know, a 6-year-old certainly does not have earned the right to vote by merit of their cognitive capacity and their ability to think about the world, whereas a 21-year-old almost certainly always has. And even if that opinion is bad, they have still developed enough to be entitled to that opinion. So the basis at which I base the first argument in terms of being pro-choice is around that, and again, using my mark of about 20 weeks, is that up until stages about sort of month like 5 or 6, which is why the 20-week kind of comes in a little bit before that, most of the capacities of a fetus have not developed adequately and have not developed consciousness adequately to the point at which we can say that that thing is now starting to comfortably become a human. And I think that that development happens somewhere later in the stages of pregnancy. Now, it's unclear where in that stages of pregnancy it happens, and of course it happens gradually over multiple stages, but I think at a stage prior to 20 weeks, we can comfortably say that the developmental human has not yet reached adequate cognitive capacity, is not yet capable of experiencing things like cognitive thought or pain that we would consider it as being a human. And so before that, it is a fundamentally different moral creature to after that, and therefore we are able to place different considerations on it. And one of those considerations is that if we think that its rights are coming in contact with a rights of another sentient being whose rights are more important, then we can prioritize those rights over them. But like, another thing I'd like to clarify is that I think that in circumstances where abortions do have to happen, that they ultimately are regrettable. I would much rather just people use adequate contraception and not get pregnant in the first place than have to go through the process of abortion, because I recognize that there is some amount of moral gray area here, and obviously the kind of safest moral path to take is one where you just sort of prevent the pregnancy in the first place. But when we consider that moral being prior to 20 weeks versus the rights of the mother who is forced to then carry it, the reasons why I think the rights of the mother win out in this particular circumstance is because I think it is a huge infringement upon that person's bodily autonomy to be forced to carry something that they do not want for that remaining period of time. Because if we consider, for example, the kinds of effects that being pregnant has on a body, if it wasn't for the fact that it was a reproductive natural part of life, we would consider it almost to be kind of akin to a virus, right? Because if you think about the symptoms and the characteristics of a pregnancy, it's something that is sucking nutrients out of your body that has characteristics of things like it causes nausea, it causes certain amounts of back pain, it causes other things within your body that are undesirable. And so at the point at which that is something that does not want to be carried by the mother, there is good reason to believe that it is kind of akin to inflicting a disease upon another person and forcing them to endure that for a period of number of months. So that is the basic calculus on which I operate, is that premise one, that prior to 20 weeks, a developmental child is a fundamentally different moral entity for something that happens certainly at birth, but also sometime in that period after 20 weeks. And that because it is a fundamentally different moral entity, that we can consider the rights of bodily autonomy of women who are forced to carry those things as being more important, and thus we can justify the termination. So that was kind of a long expanded thing. I'll pass it back for your thoughts at this stage.
Okay, so I wanna clarify some things. You say whenever like the fetus or the baby comes in, like its rights come into conflict. Under what situations do you think the rights would come into conflict?
So the premise that I'm saying there is that the rights come into conflict at the point at which, so for example, if we lived in a world where there was infinite resources and that all pregnancies, like for some reason we were a species where all pregnancies happened extravenously, like they were contained sort of like, you know, within test tubes and then grown within artificial wombs and stuff, and there was no like cost associated with that, I think that there would be no moral claim to say that you should get rid of those under any circumstances because there is no
So,
cost
no,
associated
but
with it.
we're talking about rights coming into conflict, meaning
Yes.
there has to be a situation. So, like, what situations would you say that the fetus's rights are coming into conflict with the mother's rights?
Yeah. So
That's what I
so
don't know.
the yeah. Sorry. So the rights that I'm referring to there is the rights of bodily autonomy that are carried by the mother to not have to carry something within them for a period of 9 months that they do not want. Because as I've identified that there is significant cost that is associated to them
So,
personally with.
what about the baby's right to life?
Yeah. So
So, let me, if you don't mind,
yeah,
I think that the core crux of an abortion argument crux is on, is it a human being? And at what
sure.
stage is it a human being? Because at
Yeah.
the end of the day, if it is a human being at conception, then I think you can make a ladder logic argument that the rest of this is moot because humans have a right to life.
Yeah.
So, if the case can be made that life begins at conception and then it cannot be refuted, then we are not talking about, then I would say a woman's rights to bodily autonomy and things like that do not trump a right to life.
Sure.
There's a pro-life debater by the name of Scott Klusendorf, and he does this tactic called trot out the toddler, of saying, well, like, would you kill a toddler under these circumstances? Of course, people say no, and then he goes, so we're going back to, is it a human life kind of thing. And while I don't necessarily agree with that rash of an example, I do see the point of human life. Is it human or is it not human? Is, I would argue, everything in this debate, because it changes the scope of what we're talking about here. And so I believe that the differences between like a born baby or a full grown human and that of an embryo are that of size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. Could we agree around those parameters?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So the size of someone never has much of an impact on its value alone. So, like, we wouldn't say that Shaquille O'Neal is more intrinsically valued than Peter Dinklage. Like, that now level of development, we wouldn't say that someone with Down syndrome or someone that is severely mentally disabled is more valid. Like, on a moral level, I would say the average person wouldn't say that someone is more intrinsically valuable because they're very smart versus someone who is very mentally ill. Could we agree on that?
So to some extent, that is true, because, for example, we guarantee them similar rights in terms of things like right to life and the right to not be in pain, right? But at another level, we do recognize that there is a difference between those two cases.
Oh, yeah. So
because someone, for example, who is severely mentally disabled, we don't grant them things like the right to vote or other sort of political rights that exist.
Mine is more on like human rights of just right to life.
Yes,
that's kind of what
certainly.
I'm centering.
Yeah. No, I agree. So I agree at that level that they both have the same sort of human rights. The point which I'm making in this particular case, and which relates to the abortion example, is that we do at some level recognize that they are of a different moral category, because we grant some rights to fully developed humans, which we do not grant to developmentally impaired humans. So consciousness and the ability to fully actualize consciousness, as we distinguished earlier, also distinguishes us from animals, is something that has a bearing on our moral worth. So for example, I'm not making the claim that the lack of conscious development of something like a disabled person disables their right to life, but I am determining that there is a difference between consciousness levels and how we attribute their moral worth.
I can absolutely agree to that. And so I think that, but for the purpose of should we kill it or should we not kill it, the right to life is kind of key there. Political rights are important, but I can absolutely concede to the points that you've made. Environment, I don't think that a human being's environment, changing that 8 inches down the birth canal doesn't change anything. There's no chemical process that changes the human. And then degree of dependency. We cannot, there's no debate on that the embryo or the fetus is entirely dependent, as of now with science. It has to be entirely dependent on the mother for nutrition and viability and things like that. But there are plenty of people in this world that have, or a newborn baby has that same degree of dependency. If the mother is not constantly caring for that baby, it will die. That
Yeah.
or someone is not taking care of it, it will die because it does not have the capability of survival. And so I do not think that that infringes on something's right to life. I think one thing that a misconception that a lot of people have is we view the process that the embryo undergoes kind of like assembling a car. So like say you're at the Corvette factory and you're watching a Corvette being built. You wouldn't say that just the chassis of a Corvette is a Corvette, right? You would logically say, well, no, that's not a Corvette. It needs more. And so then you'd put the wheels on and you'd still say no. And you would arguably say, no, it's not a Corvette until the final hood decal is put on and it's rolling out of rolling onto the showroom floor. I think that the misconception there is that a embryo is self-developing. It's relying on nutrients and things, but it is growing on its own. It has its own genetic code. It is completely different from the mother's. It can even have different blood types. And so that growth, just because it hasn't grown enough to attain consciousness yet, or it hasn't mentally developed yet, or it doesn't have a heartbeat, I don't think those impact that because it has the genetic code and all the requirements for being a human being. I think that it is intrinsically valuable. And so for me, the analogy, I feel like it's important to err on the side of caution because like, I agree that not all of the science is out yet, but for me, an analogy that I thought was really good was if you're driving down the road and you see what looks like a person up ahead in the middle of the road, you're going to stop. But you're not sure if it's a person. So because inherently you want to err on the side of it might be a life, well, we probably shouldn't take it. And so I think that is an important thing, is erring on the side of caution while all the science isn't out. But I would love to hear how you respond to that.
Yeah, for sure. So I agree with the cautionary principle. I think that I just apply it sort of about 5 months or rather 20 weeks later down the track than you do in this case, because I agree that it's unclear at what point we can say it's that this thing is comfortably a human, because we know that it definitely is right before it's about to be born. And we know that it's definitely, we can both agree that it's definitely not before conception. So somewhere along that line, there is like a threshold cross, or like, and maybe like a specific line threshold is too unnuanced for this thing, that likely in you're saying it's the Corvette example where there's like something goes from being a hunk of metal to being a partially developed Corvette to being a fully developed Corvette, and there are no particular delineations between when that happens. It's more kind of in chunks of those things. So the claim in which I base that I think people have the right to abort prior to 20 weeks is that we can safely determine that the significant factors that cause something that we ought consider something have adequate moral worth for its rights to start trumping the rights of the person who's carrying it doesn't happen until after the 20-week period. I don't know exactly, and the science isn't out about specifically when that period happens, but once again, using the cautionary principle that if we can push it back to somewhere like 20 weeks, and maybe if you want to be more conservative, you say like, 16 weeks or 10 weeks, and to try to get in there sort of as early as possible, that is something that I also think is defensible. So I just want to address, I think, an interesting point that I think that that you made in terms of that you would consider it to be a human at the point at which conception happens, and one of the reasons that you gave is this argument of uniqueness, right? That at the point at which like a sperm and a sperm and an egg rather are biological extensions of the father and of the mother because they have the DNA example. But once conception happens, it has its own sort of DNA code, right? I think that's a reasonable thing. I just want to kind of try to pick it apart a little bit here. What if I were to take a sperm sample from a person and then in a lab, manually alter its genetic code and its genetic makeup so that it has a unique genetic makeup that distinguishes it as being purely
Bio-
biological material
Mhm.
from the father that is now its own unique code. Would we consider then that sperm to, but due to the uniqueness property that it contains, to be something that is transferred as being morally different?
So, I think the thing is it's still just sperm. Like the sperm has to meet the egg, and
Mm,
it because the sperm isn't developing on its own. It's not growing into anything.
mm,
It doesn't have that full genetic code.
mm.
So I think we can both agree that a sperm or an egg is not a life.
Yeah.
So I'm not against contraceptives or anything like that, but I think that once that sperm meets the egg, it is it has independently, like on its own, created its own genetic code, and it
Mhm.
is independently, except for like needs and resources, it is developing. And
Yeah.
so for that reason, I think that it's because it like I think we can agree that it's very hard to right now. Of course, it's hard to pin that exact point. If we're taking human lives, I don't want to us to look back on our history and realize that it was a human life at conception and go, well, we've killed hundreds of millions of children.
Mm.
I think that it's one of those things that I would never want to do. And I think that it's very important that we err on the side of caution and err on the side of giving them the right to life. Now, I understand that there are cases like rape and incest and other things that are incredibly tragic to the mother. Um, they account for less than 4%.
Sure.
So, given right now, given that gray area, I could almost concede like those special instances. Like, do you think we could like that could be a
Yeah, for
decent
sure. I
compromise? And as far as like making it illegal and criminalization, I don't think that like if say we barred it, I don't think mothers should be criminalized or prosecuted because I think murder has intent, and I would never attribute intent to mothers who have abortions.
yeah,
I think that's completely unfair. I think that it could possibly fair to attribute it to the doctor. So I think a case could be made for the doctor, but I don't want to get into that. But
yeah, sure.
personally, with good moral conscience, I think that it's important to err on the side of giving this fetus the right to life when especially if we don't 100% know one way or the other. I think that it's completely fair to err on the side of not taking the life than taking the life.
Sure. So I think so to address a couple of those points, and I agree. I think that the more relevant part of this debate is like the discussion of like how would we go about legislating and all these sort of things are more of a policy discussion. I think that the fundamental like crux of the decision of are you pro life or are you pro choices, as we've identified, at what point you think that an entity becomes a human and thus just like morally worthy of certain human characteristics. So I think that that's yeah, absolutely where the discussion should be focused. So the point that that I kind of brought up the thought experiment of the altered sperm is because you use as a part of a justification for why a a post-conception like zygote and entity is something that is deserving of a human. One of your justifications, so one of your justifications was that it develops by itself, which is something that I'll talk about because I think it's interesting. But one of your other justifications that you presented was the idea that it was a unique entity that had its own biological code. And the point of that thought experiment I brought up is to show that what I believe is that biological uniqueness is not a grounding for different levels of moral consideration, because we both agreed that the tampered sperm cell does not have any different moral worth than a non-tampered sperm cell.
Do you
Yeah,
mind if I respond to that quickly?
certainly. Yeah.
So the main reason I say that is because there's an argument of like it's like her body, her choice.
Mm.
So the
In what respect?
like the fetus is a part of her body. There's a pretty common view that it because it relies on the mother for development, and it is her right to make the choice on it. And so
Yeah.
I didn't mean to attribute that you hold that view if you do.
No, no, no. Yeah, yeah.
But it's a common thing. So a big part of it being is like, well, it's not just the mother's body because it is so independent and so different and genetically
Mm,
entirely different than the mother. It relies on it absolutely as a vessel. It
yeah.
relies on the mother as a vessel, but it is its own entity. I think that is fair.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So I think that it's interesting that you identify that that's the kind of sentiment behind the her body her choice sort of slogan, because that wasn't my initial reading of it. My the way that when I hear that phrase, that the sentiment that I think it's trying to convey, or at least the sentiment that I interpret, is that is one of prioritizing the mother's right to bodily autonomy over the right. Like I think I will 100% agree with you that a post-conception entity is a distinct entity from the mother, that at that point they are kind of separate things. The phrasing of her body her choice, the way I interpret it is to say that is promoting that the bodily autonomy of the mother is a right that supersedes the rights of the developmental human at that particular stage. So I think that it's an interesting case to say that they are the same entity, but I think you've provided pretty reasonable arguments as to why that wouldn't be the case. But I
So
don't think it.
yeah, I didn't mean to attribute that to you as a view. So
Yeah,
I
yeah, no, fine.
apologize if
I've
you
actually
felt like
never.
I did.
No,
Um,
that's fine. I've
I've
never heard it
had
before, so I just
I've
found it
had
interesting.
several debates and I've watched several debates where they talk
Mm,
about the like them referring it to it as no more than a tumor or
mm,
that of equivalent of a tumor, and well the
mm.
difference between like a tumor and like a fetus is genetic code. Well, the tumor is like developing on its own and it's feeding on it for resources, but
Yeah.
it's totally different. So I do apologize if you felt like I attributed that to you.
No, 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 no. That's fine. I was just clarifying because I think
Mhm.
that's actually interesting, because I've just never heard, like, that's not what I thought people were conveying when they said that, and it certainly some people can. I don't think that that argument is necessary to order to take that stance,
Mhm.
because because while you've identified that it's a tumor is not an apt analogy. What do you think of the analogy that I brought up earlier of that maybe it's something more akin to a virus, where it's like a virus is something that has a unique genetic code. It's another living entity, but
Yes. So
given the relationship that the mother has,
I can understand it. I kind of disagree with it because like I believe that the fetus is human and the human like a human DNA is different from a virus and the intent is different. So the intention of a virus or its genetic code is to inherently cause damage.
mm,
The fetus is creating life, and yes, there are side effects to that, and I'm not going to discount that like pregnancies suck.
yeah,
But that is not the intention of the process.
yeah,
I don't guess you can give cells intent, but like I get, you understand what I mean?
yeah, kind of. So as in like you're saying that there's a moral difference between human DNA and viral DNA in
Not
terms of
necessarily like
like.
a moral, but there's like an intent. Like virus DNAs exist solely to cause damage and harm the
Gotcha, gotcha,
cells.
gotcha. Yeah. So
The embryology does not exist to create pure harm. It's existing to create life, and there are side effects because it puts strain on the body. But that is not the same as the embryo is intentionally just attacking the body.
It's not a conscious intent, but the
Mhm.
the purpose, if you like, of an embryo is to produce a human. The purpose of a virus is to spread itself and try to
Yeah,
like
so the
feed and
purpose
do
of
the
the
work.
womb is to grow a human, and yes, there are side effects because that
Yeah,
puts great strain on the body, but that is not the womb's intent. Like it is not
yeah,
designed to just damage your body.
yeah. No, that's certainly true.
Mhm.
So okay, deviating a little bit from what we're talking about right now and going back to some earlier points. So once again, kind of touching on the cautionary principle that you want to say is that at the point at which we don't know whether or not this qualifies as a human life, then we ought to the cautionary principle as a guiding mechanism to say that, well, we should just try to have as little abortions as possible, except in like special cases and yada yada. So the kind of counter argument that I'd like to provide to that is firstly an observation that there are certain things that we do know about the developmental process, insofar as that there are certain landmarks that scientifically we can understand exactly how much like cognitive capacity
Yeah,
a,
absolutely.
a cell development has, and we can understand exactly, like, for example, we'll never, well, maybe like certainly not within the realms of current science, know what the subjective experience of that kind of fetus is, and that would be like a perfect guiding point for at the point at which you attribute consciousness, right? Because if you had a perspective from the inside, you could say like nothing, 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 nothing. Oh, wait a minute, there's something, right?
Well, do you think that consciousness is the entire realm around it? And do you think consciousness is equivocal to humanity?
Yes.
Okay, so I
This
think
is
that's
kind of,
where we line up. I think that
yeah.
is the crux. Is I don't necessarily agree that consciousness is like the crux of. I think it's important, no doubt,
Yeah.
but there are certainly instances where if consciousness is the value of humanity, then diminished consciousness means diminished value. With
Yeah. So once
so
again, like I touched on this a little bit earlier, is that is something that we recognize because we grant differing levels of rights to differing people based on their cognitive conscious capacities, right?
but
Um,
but the
and
values don't get into like right to life.
yes, certainly. They never get into right for life for fully developed humans, because we always recognize that at despite whatever developmental disadvantages a human has, that given that we are such biologically advanced machines capable of such great consciousness, as you identified, that is, you know, distinctly different from that of, say, animals, right? That even a human with a severely detrimented conscious experience or cognitive capacity is still something that carries with it a great amount of moral worth to it, right? The reason why I focus on consciousness is, and hopefully the kind of grounds for this argument that I'm going to make, is that I've identified a couple of things that we've recognized about consciousness. Firstly, that the intuitive reason to believe that reason why we are morally different from animals is because our conscious and cognitive capacities differs from theirs. And that we've also noticed the fact that within humans that we attribute different levels of rights to different people with cognitive capacities. So that seems like a good indicator that cognition and the capacity for cognition is a good metric of moral worth, right? As premise one. So not making any claims about where, you know, certain rights lie, just that cognition is a capacity of moral worth. The second part of that claim is then focusing specifically about how it relates to abortion, which is to say at that straight after conception, so just like when the sperm meets egg, as soon as that kind of splits into 4 cells, that is a not a significant difference in consciousness or cognition whatsoever. So that is where I would refute the point that you first made, is that humanity begins at conception, because I would say at the point at which that there is no significant difference between a, you know, egg, sperm, and a 4-celled organism or a zygote, that is something that means that those things ought to be considered morally equivalent, right? The extension claim that I would then make is that given that we understand from what we are able to study of the fetus currently, that we know that just like brain development and the kind of development where we could reasonably start to assume that those cognitive capacities develop don't actualize until around the 18 to 22 week mark, that something that is on the like light side of that, say 20 weeks, or even if we want to go more restrictive and say before 16 weeks, that we can safely say that, say, before 16 weeks, the whatever it is, whatever entity it is that we are removing, that entity does not have significantly developed cognitive capacities in order for us to consider it a human or even a proto-human at that particular stage. And that because we do not consider it a proto-human, that we would then defer to what is the next most important rights, which is then the rights of the mother and the rights of the bodily autonomy to not have to then carry that pregnancy to term. So that is the basis of the argument in which I support terminations of pregnancies up until that point where it starts to get unclear about what the cognitive capacities of the entity are.
Okay. Um, and I can definitely see that. I think that it's important that we kind of get into a policy side of this.
Okay.
So like a policy moving forward. So I think we can agree on a cautionary. So you're not in any way a type to argue for like partial birth abortions or anything like that. I can see you stay for the 20 weeks.
Yeah.
Um, would you concede, or not necessarily concede, but like see an argument for saying, hey, okay, until we figure this crap out, we're gonna say at conception, except for like very extreme cases
Mhm.
of like rape and incest, until we get this figured out. Let's put a
Mhm.
stop on it. Not necessarily criminalize it, but
Yeah.
put a stop to it until research is 100%. Because I feel like it's very fair to be cautionary in saying we don't want to take more lot. Like if their lives, we don't want to take them. We want to maintain their right to life. Now, once and have that be not necessarily like a temporary law, but like a law for during this stage while we're figuring our crap out,
Yeah.
kind of.
Sure.
And then, yeah, absolutely respond.
Yeah, so the reason why I wouldn't agree with that at drawing that so once again, we both utilize the cautionary principle. I'm utilizing it later
Mm-hmm.
than you. The reason why I would still stand for like definitely for abortion within say the first like 4 weeks and then maybe extending it kind of further than there, is that like you're saying it's like we don't have the science figured out to know definitely whether or not there's a human life. I just don't know what more science we perceivably
Okay,
could get.
so
Because for
again,
example,
we're talking about consciousness, right? And
sure, yeah, yeah, yeah.
you've made the litmus test, or like the bright line for human life consciousness. Well,
Yeah.
I don't. I personally like. I'm going to admit, like, I'm not the most informed expert on this, so I don't know if I believe that consciousness is the bright line for humanity. I could always be wrong, but I don't know. And so for me personally, looking at it is like, well, if I don't know it's consciousness, I want to. You could see why I would want to err as much on the side of caution as possible, because I don't want to attribute any intent towards us. I don't believe that you think taking human lives are okay, or I think taking human lives are okay. But I think that could you see why? Because I'm not sure, then I would definitely see why. Like,
So
I'm trying.
the reason,
I
yeah, sorry.
um, and then I have to admit the bias that I'm coming into this as a Christian. Um,
Sure.
as a Christian, it's very clear, me adopting that worldview of the Bible talking about Christ knowing you before you were even in your mother's womb, and like, and
Mm.
the Bible frequently talks about intrinsic values of humans. Now, I'm not attributing that to
Yeah.
my argument, but I believe that human life is intrinsically valuable from conception, and that we have to kind of err on that side of caution. And I completely respect that you want to err on that side as well.
Yeah, that's for sure. So, yeah, and I recognize also, yeah, that there is an interesting kind of religious bias to the whole sort of thing, where it's like if tomorrow we could gain definitive proof that things like God and the soul exist and that a soul is imparted upon an entity upon conception, then obviously that's a game changer,
Yeah,
because that's like
obviously.
there's a big deal now between the difference of the two. But I think that you made the very reasonable claim that given that A, not everyone shares that worldview, and that B, that's not something that we can scientifically prove, then that can't really be a calculus
Yeah,
in
I think there's a level of philosophy in this debate.
Yes, absolutely.
The abortion date is fascinating because it's not just, well, it's not just science, or it's not just philosophy. It's this really interesting mix of the two.
Yeah, absolutely. So the claim that I'll specifically make is that within, say, so we'll start with the 4 week period, and then I'll see if I can move you a little bit into my camp, right? Is that specifically within that first 4 week period, I don't think that there's any more scientific understanding that you can gain that would actually change your decision. I think that at that stage, it's purely a philosophical question. For example, we know about what the maximum amount of cognitive capacity that a zygote could have up to a zygote and embryo could have up to a 4 week stage, because we know, like, we can count almost individually how many cells exist and what the specific functions of those cells are, right? And that is something that we know at this stage scientifically. So there's no really more scientific knowledge that we could foreseeably gain to understand about whether or not that constitutes a person, because we already
that.
know, like,
The
yeah, we
science.
already,
Okay, I will absolutely concede the science. I hate that we are out of time, but
yeah,
I
I
want.
think we can keep going after the 2 minute ends. I feel like
Well,
I've
then
seen this in open debates more.
but anyway, even if it doesn't,
Yeah,
I really want to thank you so much for coming. It's nice to have a conversation on a very heated issue, but neither of us getting angry or fiery on
yeah,
it.
absolutely.
I hope that you and I can do more.
Yeah, sounds good.
But
We've got that healthcare one that I think we planned over
yeah,
text
that
in
healthcare
a
one will be
month.
fantastic.